Happy New Year, everybody. Um, with all the crazy weather that we've been experiencing over this past holiday, with literally millions of people going without power, discussing backup generators is a timely subject indeed. What we hope you will learn in this LinkedIn Live event on how to get the grid to pay for your backup generator is how you can get a backup generator for a fraction of the expense, or in some cases, it would actually make you a profit. So I want to be very clear. We're only discussing generators for commercial, industrial, and industrial use, or institutional use. We're not chatting about residential units, not part of our business there. So again, welcome, Happy New Year, and thanks for joining us. A couple of housekeeping rules. Everybody has been put on mute. Sorry about that. But if you have a question or something, please use the chat function. If we don't get to a question or you can't get it because chat's not working for you or something, send us a comment on LinkedIn regarding this event, and we will definitely get back to you directly on that question. It is also being recorded, so if you don't like being recorded, but since you're muted, I'm not sure it makes any difference anyway. So without further ado, we only have 30, 35 minutes to go. I'd like to introduce our two guests today, panelists. First one is Cam Tower from CPower, and then also Barry Rogers from Exergy Energy. I'm going to let each of you sort of introduce yourself, what you do, what your company does, and then we're going to jump right into it. So Cam, turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. I'm Cam Tower with CPower, and CPower is the nation's leader in grid services monetization, demand response, energy efficiency, anything related to behind the meter grid services monetization. Across the country, we partner with over 17,000 sites and have successfully monetized well north of 6 gigawatts in various ISOs and markets throughout this past year. Thanks for having us today.
You guys are the largest, I think. Is that correct, in the country?
Yes, we are the largest throughout the country, the largest in a variety of various ISOs, and set the standard and set the bar in demand response across the country.
So we set the bar high with you, Cam, and you're an expert in this area. So really appreciate you joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, Barry.
Welcome, Barry.
Barry Rogers. Hello. I'm with Exergy Energy, Director of Commercial Operations. I have been in the energy industry for a little over 15 years now, starting out as a trader in the West markets, and then I moved into ERCOT and PJM, even some Mexico. In my role in Exergy, we are essentially we call ourselves a concierge utility. We basically try to take all of the energy services for primarily commercial and industrial customers, small to medium size, and we use devices such as backup generators in order to sort of monetize the load and help pay for some of the generation. Some of these guys have a mandate that they need generators. Some just want a generator as insurance policy to run their business. People have a variety of reasons, but we help them to subsidize the cost of the generator, sometimes at little to no cost, even free. And as you said before, sometimes you can make money on it.
Great. Thanks, Barry. Your audio, at least from my side, is pretty terrible. You're breaking up pretty badly. I don't know if
better.
Try again.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi is kind of spotty right here. Can you hear me okay?
It's pretty spotty. So,
okay. All right, I'll work on it. Sorry.
You might need appreciate that. So anyway, jumping right into this. So when I think of the grid, and I know this isn't fair, but when I think of the grid, I really think of the grid as a monopoly. And I know that's not true in the deregulated areas, but the reality is there's a set of wires connected to my building, and I, basically get my electricity through those wires. And the grid, the utility, they make their money selling me electricity, right? I mean, that's how they make their money. Why would they be interested at all in helping me pay for a backup generator, which by definition is working when they're not charging me for electricity and they're not making money? they might be interested to help pay for that generator. That seems sort of like oxymoronic to me. Cam, what's going on? Can you give us some background on this?
Sure. I think simply put, it's another insurance policy, or it's another card that the grid operator has to play. As we saw almost 2 years ago, there was a catastrophic winter storm that came through and impacted a large part of our country and actually turned off the lights for a major part of Texas, had some rolling blackouts in Texas. That demand response was noted, and the use of backup generators were noted by ERCOT to help save the day and stop a complete catastrophic meltdown or collapse of the ERCOT grid. Fast forward a couple of years, let's just look back a week or two ago. And on the 23rd and 24th of December, we had another instance of some extreme weather. And there were multiple grids across the country that had emergency conditions in place. And the grid operators, in this case, chose to call on folks with backup generators to save the day yet again. So in this case, they're paying a little bit of money to you, yes, to run that generator, but their end goal is to not have a catastrophic collapse of the grid, as we've seen in other areas. And fortunately, PJM, just as this example here, was able to keep its lights on through the use of end-use customers running assets locally rather than relying on the wholesale grid.
All right, so let me see if I got this right. So in these circumstances, extreme weather and things like that, the grid may not be able to supply all of the power that's required. Either the load's too high, some generators are offline, or something like that. And there's a mismatch between the demand, what we're asking for, and what they can provide. And they have basically two things they can do. One is shut everybody down, in a sense, right? Rolling blackouts or something to bring that demand and load into balance. And I think we do see that in rolling blackouts. Or alternatively, pay people to essentially disconnect or to reduce their demand, and again, bring that in balance. So my backup generator, while protecting me as essentially an insurance policy if the grid goes down, is also kind of an insurance policy, I think you're saying, for the grid as well. Is that right?
Definitely. Think of it as in a case where, the grid is potentially moving away from equilibrium, you're essentially offering up if you're consuming let's say one unit of energy, by procuring that unit of energy from your backyard or from the backup generator you mentioned, David, you're essentially offering that, instead of taking that from the grid during that hour or that instance, you're offering that back up to the grid and the community, which is in need for that marginal unit of energy at that time.
Got it. Now, is reduction in demand the only thing that sort of the grid can benefit by from a backup generator, or are there other, call them services, I guess, that we as backup people could also provide the grid that they might be willing to pay for?
There's great question. There's a variety of different flavors or different opportunities that the grid is willing to compensate someone for their availability, or essentially compensate them for this insurance policy. We mentioned equilibrium, or when supply and demand is out of whack or trending off balance. And there's programs for macro disturbances there, for micro disturbances. There are ancillary or smaller reserve-based programs. There are also economically driven programs where not the supply and demand on the local grid, but the price point of energy at a locality might drive incentives for someone to leverage a backup generator for a finite period of time rather than relying on the grid.
Okay, I got a lot to unpack there. So let me ask sort of the first one. Let's take the one where we got a demand supply imbalance, and they sort of like want to pay me to go away, right? I'm going to reduce my load there on the grid. How do they do that? How do they contract with me? How do they notify me? How do I get paid? And is it significant? I guess is a good question, because I pay a certain amount per kilowatt hour, are they going to just pay that amount to me to go away? So what's the process here?
Sure. And I think kind of fitting, we had an example of one of these emergency events you alluded to, and I alluded to earlier, just a week or two ago on the 23rd and 24th of December. PJM runs an annual program, or the grids across the country do, but where this example was in PJM, they run an annual program or a seasonal program where folks can commit a level that they're willing to pull off the grid, and in this case, through the use of a generator. And they partner with a curtailment service provider, which might have a different definition in different areas of the country, but an eligible entity that is the interface or intermediary with the grid operator, the ISO or RTO. And so an entity like CPower works with an entity that has a commercial entity that has a backup generator, and we review the generator to ensure that it's compliant and eligible for program participation and therefore monetization, the associated revenue streams. We come up with a plan and structure enrollments appropriately and submit them into the grid operator's reserve margins, essentially. And each and every day, the nameplate of this generator is getting compensated for being a part of the grid operator's reserve margins. Essentially receives a retainer payment for being on standby year round.
Okay, let me put you in the hot seat there for a second, Cam. So let's take PJM, and for those who don't know where PJM is, that's Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland area of the grid. Let's take PJM as an example. In my business, we own a 1 megawatt backup generator. We have a 1 megawatt load. Maybe that's the best way to put it. And I go through CPower as my curtailment service provider and say, hey, I'm offering this up. Okay. You can call on me, or the grid can call on me to turn off, or, whatever. For 1 megawatt, how much might I make in the PJM territory?
Great question. And like many things in this industry, that's going to depend on where you're located, how quickly you can respond. But this current year, across the board, the average capacity earnings for 1 megawatt in PJM is roughly $25,000 annually. Some zones are closer to 18 grand, some zones are north of 40 grand, but I'd say on average about 25 grand per megawatt per year.
All right. Now, I don't mean to be like negative on things, right? But, not necessarily always trusting the grid. So they'll pay $25,000 to me, or $40,000. That sounds great. But wait a second. When I'm running the generator, I'm paying for the fuel and everything else, right? So they're kind of, sort of paying 25 for what? An infinite amount of power? I mean, could they tell me to turn on for the next 8,000 hours and they get all of that energy for $25,000? Or there's got to be some sort of limit to what they can do here.
Yes. Yeah, so that's a capacity payment. So for being on standby and available all year round, you have access now to that $25,000. If and when there is an emergency event, which we haven't seen many of in PJM over the past decade, I felt a little bit better saying that comment a month ago. But back in December, there was a couple emergency events, and they called on folks at, central plants at universities, to Walmarts, to large, bakeries and steel mills and everyone in between. And those folks were called upon and reduced their usage. This, if we said the capacity component was kind of the retainer payment, when dispatched and called upon to run for a few hours, that's the billable hours component here. So looking at the 23rd and 24th of December, there were two decent sized events, especially on the 24th. And just some back of the napkin math, if you're looking at the strike price in PJM, or the minimum strike price at those 17 hours, that the emergency energy credit you could have received a couple of weeks ago would have been north of $30,000.
Wait, you could $30,000 just for the energy portion.
Yes. So you're on that 1
That's
megawatt is
added,
on standby
that's added
all year
on to the
round.
25,000, right?
Yep. That
Wow.
1 megawatt is on standby all year round and garners that $25,000 in standby payments. And then if and when it's called upon, you can generate an additional dollar per megawatt every single hour. So given that this was a 2-day event or a day and a half event, 1 megawatt would yield about $31,000.
Wow. Now, is there any limit to how often they can call me or how many hours a year that $25,000 capacity payment buys them?
Yes, there are some limits, and we've never, really seen PJM hit the full limits given the scarcity of events. But let's go back to this example. On the 24th of December, PJM didn't pull some levers that ran from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., and that is their defined window of availability where your capacity is judged for performance. On the 23rd, as an example, that 9 o'clock is when that window ends. They actually had their event continue on until 10 p.m. in order to safeguard the grid and keep the lights on for everyone. But everything after that 9 o'clock was not mandatory, and anyone that continued to provide benefit to the grid just received some icing on the cake payments.
Well, it's interesting. So having a backup generator isn't only about, I'm going to turn my light on here, isn't only about me protecting myself, but I'm also sort of being a good citizen, right? Because I'm literally helping my neighbors who don't have the backup generator by helping the grid keep their power on. Is that
Definitely
correct?
By you're being a responsible and sustainable member of your community by leveraging your flexibility or your DER.
Now you and I'm going to throw this question to Barry, but I'm going to leverage it off of you. You said something about this is an emergency. The grid calls out to you, ask you to do this thing, and then you said, well, there's also times it's not an emergency, but it's driven by the pricing, just the economics, right? Barry, what are we talking about there?
Well, if you're talking about price responsive demand, first of all, can you hear me okay? Or is it still?
It sounds much better.
Okay, great. Yeah, so there's a couple components here. One is the grid is essentially paying you because you're providing a reliability service. And then there's another one that's sort of implicit in the grid with high pricing, that the demand is high, that the grid is tight on supply. Now, that's how we leverage the generators to work against the market. So it's not necessarily we're in an emergency event, but pricing in the market is high because demand is high or supply is low. And we are another form of supply. Now, we're a very small form of supply, but when you aggregate all of these small generators across an entire ISO or power grid, it can add up to something meaningful. And so what we do at Exergy is we procure what's called a block contract. So we go out, and this happens in competitive environments, which is why it's important to know regionally where you are and how things can differ. But we go out and we secure what's called a block and index contract. It's sort of a take or pay arrangement with various suppliers in the marketplace. And this block and index contract allows us to sell off basically our
Now your video, your audio's gone.
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
There we go. Okay. You said you
Okay.
get to sell off. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, I need to turn off my cell phone here because it basically someone called me and it switched over to that. Okay, so you sell off the contract when the price is high. So we have basically put our customers, our clients into contracts, these block and index contracts, and we can use them to leverage against the marketplace. So when we say high pricing in the marketplace, we essentially have them run on the generator and then sell the contract back at the prevailing market price. So, you need to know the cost of your generator, you need to know the cost of the contract, you need to know the cost in the marketplace. And that's what we monitor in real time, such that we can leverage the generator essentially to help provide the needed energy to the market, and furthermore subsidize the cost of the generator through the revenues that will be paid on these block contracts.
All right, I'm really going to put you in the sort of the hot seat on that one, Barry. So you're contracting for the customer, essentially locking them into a supply of electricity, right? You said, if my terms were correct, it's take or pay, right? So I'm gonna take it. If I take it, I pay for it. If I don't take it, I still pay for it, right? So I'm locked into this. Why would I want to do that? Why would a customer want to have a block and index contract?
Sure. Well, let's take the ERCOT example, for instance. If you go back to 2021, when ERCOT had their big winter event, and basically the pricing went to the price cap, which was $9,000 a megawatt hour. Well, if you had procured a contract, let's say you probably could have got something for $60 a megawatt hour. Well, now I can go and run on the generator. So if the pricing environment was $9,000 in ERCOT, I could run on the generator and then sell my contract that I might have at $60, $70 a megawatt hour for $9,000 a megawatt hour. So in that instance, you're actually making that spread on your contract. And that's what we're saying subsidizes. In that ERCOT case, you would have actually made a lot of money. Now, I want to say that's a bit of an anomaly, but you would have made a lot of money having a block and index contract and selling it back to the grid.
All right, now knowing your background, Barry, and you were with an independent power producer and a generator, if I'm looking at that, I know that the grid pricing is very volatile. So you just mentioned it, you do it at, it's $9,000. Why would a generator want to sell me a block contract? Why wouldn't they just want to ride with the market? And, when it's 9,000, make 9,000. When it isn't, and things like that. Why would they even consider doing a sort of a fixed price block contract?
Well, so one thing to know is the generators don't typically sell this direct. You go to a retail provider who might get it from a generator. So it's kind of a middleman that we're dealing with here that provides the block and index. But as a retail energy provider, one of your biggest threats is your customers' usage. So if you came to me and I'm an energy supplier, I need to see what
your audio's gotten lousy again.
Is that better? I'm gonna try to hold it right up to my face. I'm so sorry about this. Any better? If I yell?
Yeah. I'll fill in here for a second. So the biggest problem is, and as everybody knows, the grid has no storage. There's no inventory to balance things out. We have to generate at exactly the same amount as our load is. And a generator only makes money when it's essentially when it's fully loaded. So they want to know what their load's going to be so they can literally set their generator and run. And if they're on the market, if they're on the index all the time, there may have some times when it's 9,000, and then there's going to be some times when there's zero or even negative pricing or things. So they would prefer to sort of lock it in now, have and essentially it's risk shifting to the customer. You're going to take it regardless of what the market price is, but with the generator, you can then take advantage of those price swings.
David, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so your usage is sort of the risk to the supplier. So if I'm a supplier, I want to go back and I want to look at your interval demand. That's one of the first steps that a supplier does. Because let's say your demand is sort of a risk to the supplier. So if your demand were to get really high at periods of really expensive pricing, that might mean that supplier is sort of exposed at what we would call the index. So that'd be like real-time pricing. And real-time pricing is the volatile piece. That's like when it went to $9,000 in ERCOT. So a supplier likes something like a block and index because they've essentially fixed your demand. They've said, okay, I sold you, let's say it's a megawatt, that I know that no matter what, you're taking a megawatt. So I can effectively, as a supplier, hedge my cost. I can go out in the marketplace and say, I know I've sold David a megawatt, so I'm going to go out and I'm going to hedge that cost so that I'm not exposed. Well, if you don't have a take or pay agreement, then you have a variable usage. So if your usage gets really high in a period of extreme heat or something like that, that supplier might be exposed at high prices because your demand is high. So that's why they like the block and index.
Got it. Thank you. So coming back to you, Cam. So I'm hearing two things. One is we've got this emergency demand response, which is kind of like I'm literally a generator on the grid and am part of the capacity that they look at. And then we also have economic demand response, where it's really the grid. I'm acting according to what the grid pricing is telling me. Now, it may help the grid if the prices are high. The grid may be under some stress. It's not in danger, but we can, help it maybe reduce costs. So I see economic and I see emergency. Are there other grid programs that if I have a backup generator, that will pay me?
Those are primarily the main two across the country. The flavors of these programs will vary slightly from region to region. So we've touched on capacity and energy or economic opportunities. There are ancillary opportunities as well, but I might put those third on the list here.
Understand. Okay, great. Thank you. It sounds, the grid is the largest, most complex machine mankind has ever built, right? How complicated is it for a company to sort of, I'll say, engage in our citizen duty of helping out the grid and participating in, let's say, emergency demand response, and then we'll get into economic. Is it complicated, and how do you do it essentially?
It's a little complicated for those that are not too familiar with it, and most folks, curtailing usage is not their core business. They're more interested in producing widgets or providing a service. And entities like CPower and other folks in our industry try to make it pretty easy for the commercial and industrial end user to participate in a program, generate revenue, but also be that sustainable member of their community, and take a lot of the navigating this backwards landscape off of their plate and manage that on their behalf.
So if I could use an analogy, I'm handing the keys to my generator essentially over to you guys, and you're doing what's best for the grid and I'll put it this way, as long as it makes me money, you'll do what's best for me and the grid at the same time, sort of all automatically.
Yeah, and that's definitely an option. Some of the most crucial and reliable assets to the grid participate in a manner similar to that. Some folks have a backup generator, but don't necessarily want to hand it completely over the keys. They'd rather get told yes and no, this is an opportune time, or this is an opportunity for you. Where other folks hand over the keys and say, let's generate some dollars and safeguard our community.
Hey, I'm all about altruism and helping the community and everything else, but sort of bottom line, I want to make as much money as possible. I have this asset, and most companies look at a backup generator as an insurance policy. It's strictly a cost. So if I can figure out how to make money out of it, or how to make more money out of it, that's fantastic. Now, when I look at the standard electricity bill that I get, which is just about as bad as my cell phone bill, right? Are there other ways, and I'm going to throw this to you, Barry, because you're more on the customer side rather than the grid side. Are there other things that you can do with a backup generator to save money in addition to, signing up for emergency, doing your citizen thing or doing economic demand response? Are there other things that you can do to make money?
Sure. Yeah. The biggest one is avoided cost, and that's on demand charges. So a demand charge is sort of, the grid has peak usage times when the grid is stressed. And at that time, they're sort of looking at the customers in the market and measuring what their usage is. And that's sort of like your contribution to this stress of the grid, right? And these avoided costs occur because we can take customers off the grid essentially and put them on the backup generator during the times when they're measuring what your contribution to this overall demand is. And in some regions, it's highly lucrative. In the PSEG regions in New Jersey or AEP in Ohio, it's worth over $100,000 a megawatt per year. Now that it varies.
I'm interrupting you there.
Sure.
I heard a very big number there. What does that mean? $100,000 megawatt, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Cam was talking about, $25 to $40,000, for being in this emergency demand response. What's this 100,000 thing you're talking about?
So it has to do with these individual regions and what they think it costs to essentially provide the services needed to deliver the energy. So that's like the transportation distribution, the wires, if you will, not the energy itself. And it varies depending on where you are. So that's what I'm saying. PSEG in New Jersey, higher, it's more expensive for them to put more transmission in there. So if you're able to avoid that cost, it helps them avoiding, they don't need to build as much transmission. So but it will vary from place to place, and in some instances it's tens of thousands, in some instances it's $100,000 plus. There's also something where it's avoided costs with regard to the capacity market that Cam had alluded to before. It's also based on some demand charges, and if you can avoid the certain days where they basically take this measurement, once again you're avoiding the capacity charges in the market.
So I got this little voice in the back of my head whispering three little letters to me saying PLC. Is that what we're really talking about? And if so, Cam, can you explain what PLC is to our audience and what it means in PJM?
Sure. And I'll kind of rearrange some of these letters and piggyback on what Barry said. So PLC is a peak load contribution. And Barry was talking about when the grid is at its peak, whether that's in Texas, the 4 highest days, or some areas it's once a month. In PJM, it's the 5 highest hours in a season. When the grid is at its peak, what is your individual contribution to said peak? And that is that facility or that utility account number that is their contribution to the peak load or their peak load contribution. So if you can mitigate your demand during a minuscule peak on the grid, that can provide tremendous economic benefit to the end use facility on their bills.
Understand. So sort of getting back to it, we got emergency demand response, we've got economic demand response, we've got avoided costs such as peak load contribution or your demand charges and things like that. Are there, I guess, if I need a backup generator, right? Because I can't go down, people die or something of it. I have to have a backup generator. There's always a way to make it less expensive by participating in these programs, right? Because if I have to have it anyway, I might as well, reduce my cost. Are there any areas in the country where having a backup generator literally could be profitable? Be literally a net profit contribution to the organization. Barry?
I wouldn't say that you could regularly count on that. If you go back, like I said, ERCOT 2021, there was an event there. Absolutely, you would have made money. And in this past event that Cameron was referencing, you would have made a little money there too. So you're making money in spurts, but you're not necessarily gonna net. I wouldn't get in the business of just installing backup generators pushing into the grid necessarily. That might be an oversimplification of how this works. But there are certainly years where that could be the case. And as we kind of progress under the current model, as we add more renewables on the system and we retire old thermal coal assets, old natural gas assets, we're increasing the volatility on the grid. And any time we increase the volatility on the grid, you're going to see these price spikes. So, it's not to say it happens every year, but some years it will. And sometimes it can be highly lucrative. It just depends. But, generally looking at things, we expect volatility to be high for the at least in the short run in terms of the next few years, as the grid kind of figures out this next iteration of more renewables, more distributed generation, more flexible loads. Also, the demand it comes on pretty hard. It used to be you'd see some of these big demands coming a long way off, like an oil refinery, and now something like a crypto miner can add just tens of megawatts, hundreds of megawatts of load in virtually no time. So all of that is just adding to that volatility.
Coming back to our customer service or being good citizens and things like that. If you have to have a generator, again, you can't go down. It can always be, we can always make it less expensive for you. And occasionally, maybe not consistently, but occasionally it can actually be profitable. Literally, it costs you sort of a negative amount. What's going to happen now from people listening to this are all going to say, oh, I've got this backup generator. It's been sitting in our facility for the last 25 years. We want to get into these programs. It's probably not that easy. Are there restrictions and things in allowing you to participate in these programs?
There are some restrictions, yes. So the generator will need to be a qualified resource at the federal level, the state level, the local level. And so that can vary, especially on the state and local level, fairly dramatically, state to state, locality by locality. All that being said, if you have a picture of your generator nameplate, your engine nameplate, and the year, the vintage, if not included there, we can very quickly ascertain whether or not that generator is eligible or not. And if it's not eligible, we can work with you to find a resource, an asset that is eligible to not only safeguard your operation, your community, but also generate some revenue.
Yeah, I think there's some different, and again, depending upon what you're participating in, emissions play a role there as well. Because I think like if it's your emergency, the emissions aren't such an issue, but if I want to do economic-based demand response, then I do have emissions and run hour restrictions and things like that, I believe. And there's all, types of permitting.
Permitting, the type of program, sizing, there's certain sizes are grandfathered in, certain vintages are grandfathered in. If they're manufactured after a certain date, they need to be tier 4. So there's a laundry list of items that the Exergy team and the C-Power team can help navigate on your behalf.
So again, sort of restating it is, there's always an opportunity to save money. There's always an opportunity to save money, but it is kind of complicated. It requires some knowledge and expertise of the market, the market dynamics.
Yeah, I think, and Barry mentioned the spiking prices. I think a lot of this comes down to being in a position when the opportunity does present itself to be in the best position to make the most out of that opportunity, both quantitatively and qualitatively.
You wouldn't necessarily recommend somebody get a backup generator for the sole purpose of participating in these things as a money-making endeavor, because if you did, it wouldn't really be a backup generator then. You're really basically just an independent power producer, right? I got it. So if you need
what I will add to that is we're talking about primarily standby resources, and the grid is willing to pay for these resources. They're in turn making them revenue generating resources. And to go a step further, we're specifically talking about generators today. So we can help turn a standby generator into a revenue generating generator as well.
Well, you just opened the door to another question, Cam. Sorry there. What about batteries? We see the declining cost of batteries, reading through the IRA, there's all sorts of subsidies for batteries. Can batteries participate in these services as well?
Yes, but batteries are terrific resources for grid services as well. They have some inherent differences from a generator, but there's a few programs that they are, let's just say, a better resource for, and some programs that they might not be as strong of a resource for. If they are, if we go back to just a week ago, one of those events lasted for 14 hours. A battery might have more trouble there compared to a generator, but some of these more frequent or faster responding programs, or where there's a signal to follow, a battery is a tremendous resource that can actually generate a lot of revenue in grid services.
All right, we're kind of coming to the end. Let me do a paraphrase a little bit, make sure that I understand what you've heard. So, number one, A backup generator not only is an insurance policy for your facility or my facility, it is also an insurance policy for the grid to provide the grid with additional, I'll call it safety. In the case we have this supply demand mismatch, that they can turn to us, pay us essentially to provide them that support. So we get, and I think that's the emergency demand response. So we get compensated for that. We then can make money in economic demand response is when the prices of the grid are high. I can essentially not buy from the grid or sell back to the grid and use my generator for my facility and make money that way. And then also I can use the generator to reduce my peak demand, my peak load contribution, which determines my demand charges. So I turn the generator on during those few hours that the grid is going to make its allocation decisions on how much they're going to charge me and thereby reduce it. And these can be fairly substantial. So emergency demand response, anywhere from, in this case, we're talking PJM, $25,000 to $40,000 a megawatt. If I got that right. PLC could be, reduction or that demand charge reduction avoided costs could be anywhere from a few thousand to as much as $100,000, which is very, very substantial. Again, I understand it's quite geographically restricted there. And then, so again, in general, you will always do better economically by participating with somebody like CPower or Exergy or something like that in grid programs and get compensated for that. What did I not ask you that I should have asked you, given your experience and things, to clarify any questions or concerns that the audience might have? Cam, what didn't I ask you I should have?
I think you hit on a bunch of the pressing topics. I think a parting comment might just be geographically where some of this fits best. All over the country, there's opportunities, but we're primarily talking about the deregulated markets. But some of the ones that jump to mind first, we mentioned ERCOT, Texas, PJM, just kind of the mid-Atlantic and Midwest, Chicago to New York City, down the Outer Banks, the Mid-Continent ISO or MISO, Mid-Continent System Operator, areas like south of Chicago in Illinois, Michigan are also strong areas. New York State and New England and Arizona, I'd probably say, are some of the strongest markets throughout the country to monetize and provide grid services support, leveraging your backup generator.
What about California?
California has some opportunity. They don't allow the monetization of fossil fuel assets as liberally as other regions, but given some of the troubles that simply put, some of the troubles that California has had in recent years with respect to their grid, they have started to add additional programs and peel back some of those restrictions for leveraging generators, which I think is a testament to the value that these assets can provide when the grid is in a time of stress.
Doing that math on my fingers here, that sounds like there's opportunity for about 85% of the population of the United States, given the areas that are sort of deregulated and participate. So thank you, Cam. Barry, what didn't I ask you that I should have?
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of building on what Cam said here is, there's a lot of programs that exist in some form today, but I think the grid is going to has always been somewhat dynamic, and it's going to have to be increasingly dynamic to accommodate all of this change. So while it might not work in your region as well now, 6 months from now, a year from now, a few years from now, these are viable programs that really a lot of these grids should be focused on implementing if they haven't already, and offering incentives to people in order to provide the resiliency and the redundancy and the reliability that's required to have an effective power grid. So, reach out to a professional in your area and someone like Exergy can help. But it's not to say if it doesn't work for you now, it might not work in a few years, because This grid is dynamic, and like Cam had said with California had a problem. They put in too much solar. So what happens in California is when the sun goes down, you just see all of this solar generation come offline, and that's become a big problem for them. So it's just changed what the issues in the grid are, and we have to be flexible to respond to those issues.
Well, since it's the new year, we're only a couple of days into it. We can do our prognostications on that. Cam, do we think that the grid is going to get more reliable in the near term, and there will be less demand for these kinds of services, or what do you think?
My answer to that is I think the grid is going to become more reliable thanks to these programs and services. This is another card that the grid operator or the utility has to play in a time of need. And with the increased penetration of renewables and therefore intermittency on the grid, which is for the most part a wonderful thing, flexibility and the dynamic nature of curtailing or a battery or a generator is now getting compensated at a premium by the grid operator, but also keeping the lights on. So I'd say that the grid is even more safeguarded due to programs and services like we talked about today.
Which, if I turn it the other way around, without things like demand response and things like that, the grid would be less stable. With the influx of more and more intermittent renewables like solar and wind, which are, again, less dispatchable and stable, we need to keep the grid as reliable as possible. There's going to be an increased demand for demand response, and we'll call it flexible load and generation resources.
Yes.
So we're optimistic that the market is very good, that the pricing is very good. And again, if you need a backup generator, there are ways to really, really reduce the cost, and in some cases, actually make money with it. Guys, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Cam, appreciate you taking the time. Good luck with everybody at CPower. Barry, thank you as well. And again, everyone, have a happy new year. And if you have any questions, we missed anything, please send us a comment and we'll get right back to you. Thanks again and have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.